There we go. Cool. All right. So, just to start off, my name is Stan. I work for Cleverence for a couple of years. I'm a partner and client executive, so I work with clients and partners, essentially sales. And my past experience for the last 10 years been doing like implementations of inventory management systems. Um, Before that, a lot of different experiences, but yeah, I've worked at a warehouse as well, so I know like the ins and outs of everything. But yeah, since you mentioned you're more in the SaaS space and the technical stuff, that would be very interesting for me to hear what you have to say. So um, yeah, that's about it from my side. Would like to hear if you can give me something about you. So, what are you doing right now? The role, the company, the scope, and just so we can have a better picture about you.
Sure. So right now I'm focused on startup operations and
Hmm.
company building work. So that, is primarily partnering with early stage founders and leadership teams as they move from the idea stage into, operational scale, also known as 0 to 1. So my most of my work, kind of centers around helping companies, build the infrastructure that will allow for the growth to happen without everything becoming reactive, and that can mean establishing, like I said, operational cadence, building OKRs and KPI frameworks, creating hiring and onboarding systems, improving cross-functional alignment, or helping leadership teams create more accountability around actual execution. What I actually enjoy most about all that is sitting at the intersection of strategy and execution. uh,
Cool.
Founders often, they know exactly, where they want to take the business, but translating that vision into repeatable systems and day-to-day execution it's a different challenge.
Yeah.
It's usually where I provide the most value. A lot of companies that I've worked with are in the phase where they're growing quickly, priorities are constantly shifting, and they need that focal point on building the operational foundation that allows, like I said, the organization to scale sustainably. And that's sometimes hard to to translate when you've got, again, a founder that's really excited about the product or the vision, and it's like, well, in order for that to fly, you need to can't build a house on a sand foundation.
For sure. Okay, that's very well said, actually. And how long have you been in this business, in this field, I guess?
So I've been in tech for about 12, 13 years. In this side of it,
Hmm.
about 7 years operations. I've had about 7, 8 years operational experience across
Cool.
different roles.
Okay, that's awesome. And like, did you end up just kind of running into this field, or was this always like the plan? You kind of knew that's what you wanted to do, or was there something else before you got into this field?
Um, Actually, operations kind of found me. I would say early in my career, I kept ending up in situations where there were really smart, talented people, with a great mission or product.
Hmm.
But there's always, at the beginning stages of everything, anything, there's not much structure behind the scenes. So,
Yeah,
things would often fall apart, fall through the cracks, communication would break down, priorities shift. And I just kind of naturally became that person, trying to create clarity and an organization around all the chaos. My first major leadership role was actually in a nonprofit program leadership where I was a program director. And actually, I didn't start as a program director. I started as a what they call a teaching artist, and kind of moved my way up the ranks. And that experience really kind of shaped a lot of how I think today. We were doing very meaningful work. Obviously with nonprofit in the nonprofit space, the resources were tight, teams are stretched thin, and we a lot of times had to figure out how to operate efficiently while still serving the people well, and moving our mission. So that taught me a lot about people leadership, communication, and building systems that are actually practical. So from there, I just kind of moved into the startup and product operations, where I realized I actually enjoy building infrastructure and the foundational side of organizations, helping teams align and all that good stuff.
Mhm.
So it definitely wasn't a master plan when I was younger per se, but looking back, I think every role kind of pushed me toward this operational leadership.
Cool. Kind of like led up to that. Yeah, I feel you on that.
Yeah.
Similar story here. uh, got it. That's cool.
And I
Right
feel
on.
that kind of happens with over time, when people are, growing in their career path. It's never really linear. I mean, for some
Yeah,
it happens like that, but I think for me, I enjoy being able to just kind of say, okay, well, what's next? Yeah.
that's cool. Yeah, I completely agree with you. That same thing here, as I mentioned. It was never very linear. It just kind of led me up to where I am right now, and so far so good, which is pretty amazing. Because yeah, I never see myself going into like ranking up the in one direction. Just kind of went all over the place, and then kind of figured out where I wanted to be. So that's cool. Completely agree with you on that. All right. Wanted to also ask as far as what your work like actually looks like. So if we're talking about like operations, whatever, maybe there's a role that you kind of remembered, maybe the one that was the biggest highlight that shaped the way, again, where you are right now, the way you're thinking now. If you have something like that.
So for clarity, can you ask the question just again so I can?
Yes, yeah. So I'm just trying to see what the regular operations look like your day-to-day work, I guess, and if there is one that kind of was the biggest highlight for you that maybe you wanted to kind of mention
Hmm,
something that was very interested, made the way you think today, you're thinking of that specific role, whichever.
okay. Yeah. So okay. Yeah. So usually, okay, I'd say usually the way that I think about operations
Hmm.
is starting with alignment first, then execution second. I think a lot of times it's the opposite, but if there's no alignment around the system, everything is it's gonna fall apart. And it creates a loop. So in most environments that I've worked in, you know, it all starts with leadership priorities, understanding what the business is actually trying to accomplish in that quarter or phase of growth, hence the OKRs. You create those and that's your guideline. From there,
Hmm.
my focus comes translating those goals into something, operational teams can realistically execute against.
Hmm.
So that usually means, establishing delivery cadences, defining ownership, which is a big one, especially if you have a different types of org structures, or whether it's flat or hierarchy or different types, aligning cross-functional teams and making sure that's another big one.
Yeah.
And make sure communication loops are tight between leadership, product, engineering, operations, etc. Day to day, I'm looking at how work flows through the organization, where seeing where decisions might get stuck, bottlenecks, where dependencies exist, where communication breaks down, and where teams are kind of losing momentum unnecessarily.
Hmm.
And from there, it becomes, I would say, becomes mostly about measurement and accountability. Like, are we tracking the right KPIs? Are priorities still aligned? Are teams operating proactively or reactively? Good operations, I think, should feel actually invisible when they're working well. People
Right.
aren't constantly chasing clarity because the structure already supports execution. Actually, the very last role that I was in, we that was a challenge for me to really kind of get, because there was no system set up. So, I
Hmm.
had to and establish KPIs, and we talked a lot about the OKRs, which the founder was very excited, had a great product, but there was no roadmap. And so I'm like, you gotta know where you're going. You're going on a
Yeah.
road trip, you gotta know where you're going, if there's a
Yeah.
destination. So, it was really tough. Just to wrap this question up, it was really tough to
Yeah.
execute that with him, because going back to what I said, people first, no one was really aligned around the actual goal or any OKR that was established. So that became
Mhm.
kind of there at that role. But yeah.
That's very interesting. Yeah, and if just to dig a little bit deeper specifically on that,
Mhm.
I was wondering what's the toughest thing out of all of that that you kind of noticed for yourself? Is it like to establish that specific roadmap and then kind of like sell it to leadership and then leadership takes act on that, or is it like the hardest to get the people to go along that roadmap that was established? Because personally, like I've noticed the biggest, like my not my issue, but that I've noticed in these specific situations where there's leadership, management, warehouse worker in our part of business. um I've noticed it's very hard to get all of those people aligned between each other, like because each and every one of them essentially has their own mm, proper structure that they believe is the best one. But then when you implement a new system, if you get something else like you to come in, and leadership does have a plan, they, like how to execute it. But then I feel like the biggest issue, again, this is my side of thing, is that to get everybody else on the same page. So I was
Mhm.
wondering, in these kind of scenarios, just like you were talking about, when there was no structure, was there any specific either people issue or maybe some other issues that you've noticed that were just like the hardest to fix?
Um, yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head.
Okay. Sorry about
It's
that.
it boils down to people.
Okay.
And I think that, that is probably the hardest, thing to deal with, or to try and create alignment. That's very
Mhm.
difficult, because not only do you have, there's several layers to that. So you have, the people, or the like in each I'm sorry, not community, but
Like department.
each department. Yeah, thank you.
No
They
worries.
have their way of doing things, but then the actual person has their interpretation or their personal ways of attacking, this problem or this
Yeah.
challenge.
Yep.
So I think, one of the ways that I've personally went about, kind of mitigating the chaos is, um, having, when we have these meetings and these retrospectives, and I think this just comes from building the company culture, and
Hmm.
having people to understand, like, honesty, clarity, transparency, all of that stuff is, very important. So when things are happening, you can speak exactly what's on your mind, so
Hmm.
we can figure out how to merge everybody's thought process and whatnot. Because if someone, I'll give you an example, if someone is holding back, they feel like, well, I don't really like this particular, we've got these OKRs, but I don't really like what's going on here. But they don't say anything,
Yeah.
you're not going to be able to fully engage in whatever's put forth. So
Yep.
when, we really encourage people to say, okay, I don't like that, and then we can explore, okay, so what don't you like about it? Let's talk about this. And now a lot
Yeah.
of creators or founders don't really like to do that, because they say that it steals time away from, forward movement. But I'm like, if you don't
Yeah.
have alignment, you're gonna it's like you're gonna be crashing into into
Same
success,
thing.
or whatever, or failure, without knowing what you're doing. So I think once you get that clarity from everybody on the team, then you can start to put the pieces together. And it may take a while, but it's worth it in the long run.
Hmm. Very
Yeah.
true. Yeah, I completely agree with you on that. Yeah, not much else to add there. It's very frustrating to see when people yeah, kind of just close in within themselves and don't really say anything about the problem, and then it just kind of it just snowballs, and then it usually just becomes out of control when people don't communicate properly, specifically in these industries. All right, cool. On the points of the SaaS environment, since we're a SaaS company, just wanted to kind of have some more kind of relevant things. Like, did you ever work with anything like with any systems, like where you were present, they're implementing some systems maybe, or anything like that, like software, obviously.
Yeah, there was a role that I had that actually, yeah, I have a couple of experiences. One, I say I finally remember, the other not too much, if I'm being honest.
Got it.
Um, yeah, on one of the companies, it was actually an AI product, and
Oh, cool.
as you know, AI is still evolving. It's not brand new, but it's still new in terms of like its particular applications across different, domains or functions.
Yeah.
And um, you know, that was an interesting situation because we were up against, obviously, and this is every company's challenge, I think. We're up against time,
Yeah.
money, market viability. Like, okay, we want to get to market before someone else maybe that has the same idea. So, have all those elements together. It's like it becomes a pressure cooker. And people are like, and then at that point, no one's listening to everybody because they're like, well, we got to do this way. We got to do this way. And it's just like, okay,
Mhm.
hold on. Let's just take a breath
Yeah.
and
As
see,
fast as possible.
yeah, what's actually happening here. So yes, I do. I've had that experience, and sometimes it can be fun. The challenge of like really trying to figure out what's happening, what we're gonna do, how we're gonna be different from maybe another offering, and then
Mhm.
other times can be not so fun because everyone's so kind of like the pressure of getting this product or this project off the ground that can be tough to deal with.
Right. Yeah. Completely agree with you on that. Cool. Yeah. So, couple of SaaS companies then. So you do have I guess, the visual experience of seeing how those things get turned into the market, the clients, and stuff like that. I was
Mhm.
curious if you had any specifically with like inventory management or anything like that, like the supply chain at all. Just curious.
Not so much. Yeah,
Okay.
that's not something, not a domain of mine that I'm, you know,
Got it.
yeah.
Got it. That's fine. That's fine. What else did I want to ask? It is a bit tougher because my questionnaire was all about, supply chain kind of questions. So, um, curious what else to ask you to kind of make this as wholesome as possible. As far as then, let's just talk about like the operation specifically. Like what like the dream operation would look like. Let's just do that. I think that's everyone with with um with any kind of experience in any kind of field, I think could have an idea again, right? Just like how you said that people interpret things differently individually. So I think everybody would be able to answer that question for like if you're starting fresh, and again, let's say you're making your own SaaS company, build it however you want. What would the dream reality of operation would look like? Doesn't matter which field we're talking about.
Yeah. Um,
I can help you right away that people communicate well from what I'm hearing. I think
yeah. Well,
that's a
yeah.
big
So I'll say, in my view, I mean, see, the dream operation is one where, like, well, we just actually talked about a lot of this, just a la carte here, but one where
yeah.
strategy, people, and execution are fully aligned and in full alignment. Everybody knows,
Cool.
what the priorities are, who owns what, how decisions get made, and how the work sort of moves across the business without constant friction. There's
Mhm.
clarity, and it's not chaos. The best operations setup usually is not overly complicated either. I've seen where people try to complicate things, and I also think that that's why maybe founders or companies that like to move fast, they when
Mhm.
you talk about operations, they're like they balk at the idea of really investing in that because there's a lot of layers to it and it can become complicated. It can,
Right.
but again, I think the best operations, the setup is usually not overly complicated. It has a strong I think the key indicators is strong communication loops, visible priorities, clean handoffs between teams. That's that cross-functional,
Yes.
capabilities, and then a system for measuring what actually matters. So instead of
Mm,
people constantly, reacting to fires, they can focus on moving, the business forward with much more intention.
nice.
When operations are working really well, from what I've experienced and seen, they almost, like I said before, become invisible. Like a
Right.
CEO job is to basically kind of maintain. You really shouldn't know that they're in the room if everything is going okay.
Very
Um,
true.
yeah, so people are not necessarily spending all their energy chasing clarity, like I said before, because the structure, the foundation already supports it if it's
Mhm.
built. Yeah.
Very well said. And I'm curious, like, is there, I guess it's more of like, coming to you as a for your expertise, but if there's no structure but the business is already thriving, how would you say is the best, like what's the best approach to, like how do you approach that? Because yeah, you deal with those type of things, like where do you even start when there's bad communication, there's no like proper structure, but the business is doing well, again, just like you mentioned, you worked at a couple where the idea is great, everything is already turning profit, it's working, but everything else is just that operational, specifically what you're doing, is
Mhm.
not there. And like, where do you even start to kind of, in that, like, I don't know uh, if I
Huh.
position that question good.
No, yeah, it's that's actually a really good question. And there's a couple ways that I can answer this. I'm gonna take a stab with this with what my gut is telling me first.
Yeah.
Uh, you know, okay, I'd say that a business can thrive for a while without much structure, especially if the team is strong.
Right.
You know, founder is highly involved. The product has a real market pool. I mean, you can think of some things that have gone, sold like gangbusters,
Yeah.
and that's fine when everything is, the success, or at least the perception of success is that, oh, we're a thriving company, we're in demand, yada yada yada.
Yeah.
Um, but usually what's happening is, the business is being held together by people, working around these structural gaps rather than, the system itself carrying the weight, if that makes sense.
Very true. Yeah.
Yeah. So the risk is that, success can hide operational weaknesses for a period of time. Then as the company grows, complexity increases, communication gets harder, decisions slow down, and things that used to work informally, they stop working. So I think my view is not that structure has to come first in a rigid way, but at some point, I think the business has to build enough operational discipline to support the level it's going into. Um, I think smart businesses, I mean, kind of, going backwards a little bit, smart businesses, even if things are successful and you have this like runaway success that I just, described,
Hmm.
um, you still put a lot of emphasis on your foundation, and that's your organizational structure. If you don't
Hmm.
do that, I think, you're going to find yourself with issues that you don't really have to have, if you
Yeah.
start, from the beginning. So in a nutshell, if a business is, already thriving without structure, I'd look at that as a positive signal, but also as a warning sign that it may
Hmm.
be nearing the point where, there's gonna be a collapse somewhere. And then, you start to kind of, you'll see where those fissures are, and then create strategies to fix them.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Very well said. Yeah. Very well said. And yeah, there's not much else to add to there, actually. I was thinking of something, but then I was like, no, that's actually right to the point. Right to the
Yeah.
point.
Thank
Um,
you.
yeah, you're welcome. Yeah, just have a couple more questions because I said I'm not that specifically in operations, but then I'm learning a lot. So this is very insightful for me. So thank you for that.
Sure.
What else do I want to ask? Yeah, just I have a couple more questions. In regards to, I guess, let's call it your expertise, your wisdom on the field, specifically in this business. What would you say is really shifting right now? Is there anything that you've noticed? Is like obviously the AI is taking a lot of things, but specifically from where you're sitting, is there anything that you've noticed in the past, I don't know, five years, and thinking in the future that wow, this is actually changing this whole industry, if there's anything like that?
Let's think about that for a bit.
Because yeah, while you're thinking, because my first thing, again, not expert in this specific field, but I would have thought that due to the AI and some like companies repositories and things like that, it always seems like specifically operations could be thriving more now because there's less human to human interaction. They can just go to like AI and say like, okay, hey, like for example, Cleverance, right?
Mhm.
Go into Cleverance database, get me all the answers to my questions instead of going to like the manager. Then if he doesn't have the answer to this question, he's got to go somewhere else. You know what I mean? But that's just my kind of first thing that I thought of as to
Yeah.
what's been changing in that uh, side of things.
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the biggest shifts is that operations is becoming, I would say, much more data driven and much
Okay.
more real time than it used to be. Teams used to rely a lot on manual check-ins, instinct, and this sort of static reporting,
Yeah.
whereas leaders are expecting visibility much faster, and they want to make decisions, obviously with better information. So AI is a big part of that, but I think the larger shift is really around decision velocity.
Mm,
Companies under considerable more pressure to move quickly. So operations is no longer just about, maintaining order. It is increasingly about building systems that help teams adapt quickly without losing alignment or like I said, visibility and the trajectory of the where we're going and the target.
mhm,
So I also think that there is a growing expectation that operations leaders understand not just processes, but product, people, and technology altogether. The role is becoming, much more cross-functional. You can't just build a workflow and call it a day. You have to really understand how teams actually work, what tools support them, where automation makes sense, and where human judgment still matters most. For me, having a background in I'm safe certified, Scrum Master. That's a really big
mm,
component of that the whole chain. It's like the people aspect, and I think that's becoming a lot more visible than how it ever was, because again, it was all about what systems do you have, what processes, but it's the people behind the systems and the processes that move. And so with the velocity and the people and all of that, you have to really work to create alignment. And AI has amazing tools to do that, but it's still it's the people. So in a nutshell, I mean, I think the biggest challenge is that operations is sort of moving from being seen as, like I said, back end support to, being more of a strategic function that directly, affects that speed, scalability, and the quality of decision making.
very well said as well. Yeah, I didn't think of that actually. It's more even coming to like as you would say like the front end of things, like actually being on the floor because again of the generations that are coming up right now, like who's actually in the work field right now, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot more communication that needs to be present right there rather than in
Yeah.
the back end.
Yeah. And that, this is, on another note, but relevant, you
Hmm.
know, and like the communication skills, like these are, in any field that you go into, you have your hard skills, your, what you're, certified in and all that stuff. And then you have your soft skills. And
Right.
I've noticed a trend in soft skills becoming more must-haves. And it's interesting because we call them soft skills, but
Yeah.
they're much more important because those are the drivers of this alignment and all these workflows and all these things, the cross function, all of that. That's those soft skills are really, really the glue which helps those things thrive. Yeah.
Yes, I completely agree with you on that. That's learn a lot, and I've actually just remembered my some of the courses that I've I've taken as well back in Canada there.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I'm coming back. You just kind of gave me like a little food for thought that it seems like the hard skills right now are nowhere near as important as they used to be like 10, 15 years ago, I would say. Because
Because because the
go ahead.
thing is, and sorry to cut you off, but I have to say this because
Yeah,
you can learn, anyone can learn literally, it's not difficult to learn a hard skill. You can
yeah,
learn how to code, you can learn how to do all these things. But, learning things like, and this may sound funny and off the beaten path, but it's important in business, empathy.
yeah,
And understanding when someone is having a tough time at work with even if it's a personal problem that is translating to how they are performing at work, and knowing how to mitigate that, because that's a very big part of our life. I mean, you look at the world today, there's a lot of crazy things that are going on, and we're not machines. Like, these
yeah,
things affect us, and it also affects how we do our work. So if we're not aware of that, as an operator, if I'm not aware of these things, and that this doesn't necessarily mean I need to turn into a therapist, I still need to be aware that this is going to affect the workplace. So in how we build the workplace, and the infrastructure
mhm,
around that is important, where it's like, okay, I need a moment, let me just go, instead of, oh, well, you're on the clock, we've got to
yeah,
get these things done. It's like, okay, take a moment, you still got to get the work done, but I understand. Take your moment, and you need some time. We got you. So I
right,
think all those things come into play, and I'm happy to say that I feel like a lot of companies are starting to take notice, and be a lot more open to that very real thing of, like, we're dealing with human beings, and things can get
yeah,
they can get a little messy. you know
yeah.
yeah,
Very true. And everyone is an individual and everyone has their own days too. So yeah,
yeah,
I completely agree with you. Back in the day, people used to be treated more like robots, specifically in the supply chain. I've noticed, like as I said, I worked at a warehouse before, and
yeah,
just you know, being on the other side of things now, implementing systems, going to warehouses, seeing how even managers talk to like regular operators, warehouse workers is just such a on another level actually. And
yeah.
I like it, to be honest. I think it's much better because you can clearly see that people are just like they're happy with what they're doing, to be honest. And
Yeah,
it should have been.
exactly. When people love what they do, and they feel safe, there's a psychological safety in the
Yes,
environment that you're working in, and there's a level of trust that the managers and the operational, the upper management can create. There's nothing that you can't do with a team that is also very skilled at those hard skills.
exactly.
That's like the perfect trifecta, if you will. Again, like you mentioned, managers are starting to take note. I mean, I've worked with some guys that, you know, technically, I mean, they're like the best of the best, but sorry to say, no human skills. Like,
Yeah,
they don't, they're just like a blank page when it comes to, really understanding, what someone is going through. Even even if it comes down to, I mean, I'm not talking about from a personal standpoint, but I'm talking
yeah,
about, like, when I'm having a difficult time connecting with this person who's like, well, it's all about the numbers and the dollars and the cents and whatever. And it's like, no, 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 let's talk, person
yeah.
to person. Yeah. So that's really important.
Yeah, that's on point. I like that. Right on. Um, yeah, that's really about it. I just have one last question. I don't know if you can answer it, if it like kind of scrapes your field somewhere a little bit, but I feel like it does.
Mhm.
And it sounds like this. So if you brought yourself back earlier, like way back in your career, before the systems, before the digital tools, um, what do you think about automation then, and how is that different now? And I feel like you have used at the very least, some software specifically where, I would say like 10 years ago that was done on paper or, differently without the automation. Even with people, you can automate things, right? So yeah, if that question is relevant to you, let me know.
Yeah. Let's see. Yeah. So early in my career, I probably viewed automation, mostly through the lens of efficiency. Like,
Mm, That's a
how
good
do we
one.
save? Yeah.
Yeah.
How do we save time, reduce manual work,
Mm-hmm.
and improve output? And I still think that matters, obviously, but now I see it a little differently. Now I think the real value of automation is, that when it's done well, it gives people space to focus on higher level thinking, better collaboration and more meaningful work instead of constantly, operating in, I mentioned this before,
Yeah.
reactive mode.
Yeah.
So it's not just about like replacing steps, but it's about improving how the organization functions as a whole.
Right.
That said, I also think companies sometimes overestimate what automation can actually solve. You can automate processes, but you cannot automate alignment,
There you go.
trust, things that we talked about, accountability or leadership. So my perspective now is that automation works best when, the operational foundation is already clear. Like I, mentioned
Mm-hmm.
before, other, you're just automating confusion. And
Exactly.
that's not great.
There we go. That's awesome. That's it. So what I want to say is to some of our clients, future clients, present clients, is first go to Norman. He will set you up with the proper structure and then come to us to automate things. Because I've noticed that a lot of times as well. And people expect like the leadership, they expect from automation to come like all these gains. But then
Mhm.
you come there and you realize that even right now, they don't have a proper structure whatsoever. And no matter how many devices, how many softwares, how many gadgets you're going to get in there, and even if you spend $1 million on it, like nothing's going to change because you got to actually kind of step back a little bit and
Yeah,
structure, provide that structure before going to the next steps. So,
yeah. I mean, I always, one of my favorite sayings is, people people create performance, systems create consistency. You need both. But if I had to choose one, I'd bet on aligned people every time because that's the driver of everything we're doing.
there you go. Couldn't have said it better. That's perfect. Right on. So that was it. Those were all my questions. Just